Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilden is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 5 ways to fix the Warlock quest Lakkari sacrifice. As we move farther and farther into Journey to Un'Goro, it has become quite clear that this card just isn't very good. It's far too hard to actually activate this quest. Decks that are able to activate it quickly often just do better without it and play more of a zoo discard style as opposed to a quest style. Having to spend the mana on turn 1 really hampers that style of play, so it's kind of counterintuitive and disjointed in how it actually works. And thus far, outside of some very niche decks that have occasionally won a few games here and there, this thing just is completely absent from the meta, and nobody has really made it work at a top-tier competitive level. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is a failed design, and there are some ways that it could be improved. Now, of course, Blizzard virtually never buffs cards, so I'm not suggesting that these proposed changes will ever actually take effect. I don't think anybody out there is listening in the Blizzard world that would implement these changes, but I do still think it's a healthy exercise to talk through some of the ways this card could be improved, because that really gives us a sense of why it failed and helps us avoid design pitfalls in the future. Even though you and I may not be designing the cards, it's still the kind of information in the discourse that I think builds a healthier game and more balanced cards in the future. So all that said, let's go ahead and jump into my 5 fixes for Lakkari Sacrifice. My first fix is one that tries to tackle the issue of how hard this quest is to actually satisfy, and that's the fact that 6 discards ends up being a lot. It didn't seem like that much when I first saw this card, because it feels like you can constantly discard cards as Warlock, but to do that in a way that doesn't cause you to make misplays or have, really bad interactions on the board. In other words, discarding when you want to and discarding cards that you want to discard. Sometimes it requires a little bit more control and timing, and it just ends up taking a long time to discard 6 cards if you actually want to do it successfully and stay active on the board and not just lose the game at that point. So essentially pulling back on that number and making it 4 discards does a couple things. It helps you both activate the quest faster, but it also allows you to sort of meter or control your play in a way that doesn't completely sacrifice the sound decisions you typically make in Hearthstone just in order to satisfy the quest. So it allows you to play better, it helps you complete the quest faster, and of course this quest is the kind of thing that does take a while to actually get rolling, just because of the way that imps are summoned and aren't able to attack immediately. They don't have that many stats, so you kind of need multiple turns for the nether portal and the summoned imps to really benefit you. And essentially, all of that starts happening faster. You're not sacrificing as much board along the way. And then suddenly you have a deck that can be a little bit more consistent while achieving the quest. And then the payoff of the quest is actually higher as well. So it just kind of strengthens everything along the way. And it's a very simple, easy number tweak that would make the card much more playable and, frankly, a lot more fun as well. Up next, I have a change that I'm not 100% sure this would make the card considerably better, but it certainly could, because it would encourage a different way to build around this card, and specifically would make the Lakkari Sacrifice quest much better in control-style decks. This probably wouldn't help a ton in zoo-style decks, but let me get to the actual change, which is that instead of summoning just 2 3/2 imps every turn, I'm suggesting that the nether portal would actually summon minions that you have discarded. So in other words, if you discard that Doom Guard and it's the only thing you've discarded, say you discarded 3 spells, right? Or maybe 5 spells, right? Suddenly you'd be summoning 2 Doom Guards every turn, which would be totally insane. Now that is obviously an edge case if this were to ever take place, but instead you might be summoning a couple Cruel Dinomancers, or maybe you accidentally summon a Clutch Mother's Avus and it's a 2/2 and it's a little bit worse than imps, but you also summon a Doom Guard. Essentially, the better the kinds of cards you're running and the better kinds of cards you'd be discarding in a more late game style quest Warlock deck, then essentially the more powerful that the portal would actually become. So instead of just rather meager 3/2 imps, you could summon big giant dudes along the way. Maybe you would summon an Abyssal Enforcer, right? And you get an Abyssal Enforcer and a Doom Guard. Like, that would be nuts every turn for free. That's absolutely outrageous. So this would encourage essentially different kinds of decks being built around the quest. Might even be good in Zoo, too, because sometimes maybe a Malchezaar's Imp is actually better than a 3-2 Imp, right? There's kind of variation there that could work out well, just depending on how you assemble your deck. But not only that, I do think it would also just increase the raw power of the quest, too, because you could essentially high roll, you could provide bigger swings, you could include tons of charge minions so that you're summoning charge minions consistently. There's all kinds of things you could do, so it's more flavorful as far as I'm concerned. Like, you're discarding cards, you're sending them into the Twisting Nether, you're summoning a portal, you're bringing them back from the Twisting Nether, and they're back on the board, so there's more fun to it there. It kind of makes sense in a way, too, just the way the interactions work with discards and portals and everything. And finally, I think it might just actually make the effect, the reward for the quest, better in the long run, too. Moving on to my third change, this one is that I think it'd be much, much, much better if you didn't have to actually cast the spell to activate your quest reward. It costs 5 mana to cast Nether Portal, and essentially that means you're using often a whole turn or most of your turn to summon 2 3/2 imps. And when you're in the mid game, the 5, 6, 7, 8 mana range, somewhere around there, that's just not a very powerful play. It's so passive that you just kind of throw a couple really weak minions out there, giving your opponents like an entire turn to attack with minions they already had on the board, to develop additional stuff, very efficiently trade into the imps that are summoning, or just AoE them down with little regard while developing more stuff. Essentially, you're kind of passing up an entire turn of tempo, while of course building considerable late game value, and infinite value technically with Nether Portal. But the way Hearthstone works, that's only relevant in a very slim number of matchups. Most of the time, it's all about tempo on the board, big swings, and staying alive. And frankly, casting Nether Portal at this point in Hearthstone, and probably any meta in Hearthstone's history, is sort of just a suicide move, because you're just sacrificing so much time and so much board for very little instant reward. The payoff is so delayed that it's just not worth it. So if you reduce the cost, just made it a 0 mana spell, or it just happened automatically, right? Doesn't really matter in either case, it'd be fine. It's just that if you didn't have to spend the mana and you're able to accomplish other things alongside the Nether Portal more consistently, then it would be much easier to stay alive on the board, stay in contention for the board, and not just lose everything over the course of a single turn, and then continue to develop in the future with imps that are kind of complementing what you're doing already and just building on that base level of power and making you better and better over time. So, in other words, this makes it a little bit more swingy than it currently is, which I think would be really, really helpful. Now, some people might say there's sort of a thematic consistency with the quests where they all cost 5 mana, or the warrior quests cost 3 mana for the weapon and 2 mana for the new hero power, costing 5 mana total in essence. So this would be a departure from that, but who really cares, right? Like, that doesn't mean anything. There's no reason for that to be. That's completely arbitrary. Plus, they already deviated with warrior a little bit, so it'd be totally fine to just make this happen automatically, cut the cost out, whatever the actual execution of that mechanic is. This would make the card considerably better and might actually be just enough to make the deck playable too. Moving on to my fourth and fifth recommendations, they kind of build off the previous one in that they're focused on acquiring more tempo when you actually play Nether Portal. In other words, not sacrificing the board completely, but doing something that your opponent has to react to. Making a swing turn, because I think that's really what quests need to be about. When you think about the rogue quest, it's a huge swing. When you think about most of the quests, there's some sort of big element that either saves your life or forces your opponent to react in a major way, or they just lose the game. And Warlock doesn't do that. It's a very slow burn. But this change, I think this is my fourth recommendation at this point, is that you should make the portal summon 6 imps immediately. So right now when you play it, you get the 2 imps, and you get 2 imps forever. I'm suggesting that for the first iteration of the portal, the first turn it's played, it summons 6 right away, so it fills the board with imps if it can. And then in subsequent turns, it still only summons 2, so it's not like 6 every turn. That might be a little too much. But just the first turn, that turn that you're sacrificing all that mana, because you need some sort of payoff for your mana. So yes, you would theoretically get 18, 12 in stats for 5 mana, which would be a ton, but everything only has 2 health, so it's very susceptible to trades, it's very susceptible to AoE clears, it really wouldn't be all that different than Druid's Living Mana for 5 mana, right? That has a considerably bigger downside, of course, but this is a quest that you already paid all the downside. You paid the price to activate it. It's not just a normal card like Living Mana. So summoning 6 3/2 imps does not seem out of the realm of possibility to me, but it's the kind of play that your opponent has to respond to because it's so much damage on the board, it's so many stats, it allows you to do so many more things instantly on that next turn instead of just getting 2 3/2 imps that are practically irrelevant on turn 6, 7, 8. 6 3/2 imps is much more to work with, and I think that it would provide the kind of swing necessary to make the card playable once again. And then finally, for my 5th recommendation, the 5th fix for Lakkari Sacrifice, this is very similar to the previous 2. As I mentioned, it's more about making that Nether Portal play really significant. And in fact, this one's a little bit of a meme even towards the Rogue quest, because even with this change, if you change the stats of the imps from 3/2 to 5/5, just making those imps much more impactful, it's still not as good as Rogue quest, right? Because the quest Rogue, every minion becomes a 5/5, and the way that deck is built, they can often run 4 or 5 and just slam you with charge minions and do 25 damage in a single turn after playing the quest, right? Or theoretically much more even. So this wouldn't even get it close to the quest Rogue, but it would be a major change that would certainly help at least a little bit. Frankly, I think it could summon 5/5s with charge, and it may not even make the quest overpowered compared to quest Rogue. It would be in a very similar kind of world. Maybe a happy middle ground is 5/5 imps that have taunt. So at the very least, your opponent has to react and has to constantly work through the Nether Portal reward. Maybe that's too overpowered, but frankly, I'm not sure that it is, just because it's so hard and so inconsistent when trying to achieve this quest. I feel like this change is actually rather balanced. I don't think it would make Lakkari Sacrifice overpowered at all, but it might in fact make it playable. So in the scheme of things, in the realm of all the quests available, even this change wouldn't make Lakkari Sacrifice one of the top tier quests in my mind. It would merely be a middle tier quest instead of the very, very bottom tier quest that it is currently. So once again, just all about tempo, board swings, making this card more active, harder to ignore than it currently is when it comes to the reward. So essentially, a couple changes that are a little bit more focused on achieving the quest, but really at the end of the day, I think you have to solve that tempo issue, that board presence issue, that swing issue with Nether Portal itself, not the actual quest activation, but the quest reward to make this card viable. And there you have it. Those are my 5 fixes for Lakkari Sacrifice. I was really excited about this card when I first saw it. It just seemed like so much raw value. But of course, the way Hearthstone works with just how fast the game can be, it turns out Lakkari Sacrifice pretty much sucks. And that makes me sad, and I'd love to see this card improved. At the very least, I know Blizzard will never change the actual card itself to buff it. That never happens. So at the very least, I hope Blizzard learns a little bit that you have to focus on certain things to make cards playable, and that at the end of the day, as cool as this one could have been thematically, I think they kind of whiffed a little bit and missed the potential that this kind of card holds, and that makes me a little bit sad. But at the end of the day, I'm curious what you guys think could be fixed about Lakkari Sacrifice. What would make this better? What kind of supporting cards could still make Lakkari Sacrifice good in the future? Are there new discard cards that could make it good in the next expansion, for instance? I'd love to hear all of those ideas. So until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.